Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine stepping into the ruins of an 11th century medieval fortress.
Right, a place completely shattered by centuries of artillery fire.
Exactly. The ancient stones have been scavenged, sold off by revolutionaries. It is a monument to total destruction. Now, imagine an 82-year-old woman walking into those massive, sprawling ruins, picking up a trowel, and deciding to rebuild the entire abbey by hand.
It is a staggering image to start with.
It really is. Today, we are examining an immensely dense historical figure, Julie Françoise Catherine Postel, who the world would later know as Saint Mary Magdalen Postel. She was a fisherman's daughter who openly defied the French Revolution, operated as a clandestine leader of the underground church, and physically resurrected a dead monastery in her 80s.
And we're pulling from a massive stack of sources for this deep dive today. We have everything from the fiscal archives of the Abbey of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte to first-hand biographical accounts from the Reign of Terror, straight through to modern congregational records.
So the mission of this deep dive isn't just to recite a biography.
No, not at all. It is to dissect the mechanics of how one woman survived the bloodiest era in French history. You know, how she navigated immense human friction and ended up building an empire out of literal ruins.
So to really grasp this, we have to start at the foundation of her conviction, which means placing ourselves in the year 1756 in Barfleur.
Right, a rugged, wind-battered port village on the coast of Normandy.
Picture a maritime environment entirely dictated by harsh weather and physical labor. Her father, Jean, was a fisherman, and her mother, Thérèse, ran the household. In this environment, survival was the primary objective. Yet, from a very early age, Julie displayed a radical, almost disruptive level of generosity.
Right, because when you look at the accounts of her childhood, this wasn't just normal kid stuff where you share a toy.
Right.
The texts document an extreme internal discipline. She would frequently part with her own lunch, giving it to hungry schoolmates.
Knowing she would go hungry for the rest of the day.
Exactly. In a physically demanding coastal town, skipping meals is no small thing. There is even a recorded instance of her removing her own shoes in the street to give them to a beggar girl. And by the age of 9, she'd already taken a private vow of chastity.
Which signals a psychological framework that was preparing for a life of intense deprivation. But wait, hold on. There's a specific event in the sources that illustrates this discipline, and I have to push back on it a little.
A duel?
The duel. According to the accounts, when she was just 9 years old, she stumbled upon 2 young men in Barfleur who were about to fight a duel. The story goes that instead of running for help, this child stepped between them. She gathered her schoolmates, instructed them to kneel on the cobblestones, and began to pray for the men to stop.
And supposedly they dropped their weapons.
Right. As the first blow is about to be struck, the duelists instantly reconcile. A 9-year-old girl steps between 2 grown men with swords and prays them into submission. I mean, I have to ask, doesn't that sound like a myth? Like hagiography added by her followers years later to build up a legend. Is there actual historical evidence for this?
It is entirely valid to question the mechanics of that moment, especially when looking through a modern lens. But you have to contextualize the honor culture and the specific religious environment of 18th century Normandy.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, the piety of that era was rigorous. The social pressure of public morality was immense. A child stepping into a deadly conflict, falling to her knees, and demanding peace through sheer spiritual authority. It creates a massive psychological disruption. She broke the script of the duel.
Because the men were operating on pride and aggression.
Right, and she introduced a level of public moral shame that forced them to stop. And we know this carried real weight because the father of one of those men actively sought out this 9-year-old girl afterward to specifically thank her for saving his son's life.
I mean, the psychological burden of that is immense. Imagine you are a 9-year-old child and you are forced to act as the moral anchor for the adults around you. It requires a personality that does not look away from conflict, but actively steps into the center of it. What kind of environment produces that unyielding conviction?
It's a combination of that coastal grit and deep spiritual discipline. And that rigid conviction naturally propelled her toward education. She was sent away to be educated by Benedictine nuns at Valognes.
Which wasn't just about learning to read.
No, it was about acquiring a structured academic foundation. It shifted her from being a child of singular, localized piety to an adolescent preparing to take on broader societal burdens.
And she certainly did not waste any time utilizing that academic foundation. In 1774, at the remarkably young age of 18, she returned to Barfleur and opened a school for poor girls.
which is an incredible undertaking.
It is. I mean, operating a school at 18 years old in the late 18th century is a logistical mountain. It's like a modern teenager attempting to manage a complex social enterprise, but without any infrastructure. You don't have a standardized curriculum or state funding. You have dirt floors, no supplies, and the immense emotional responsibility of educating children who have nothing.
To really grasp the significance of this act, you have to look at the socioeconomic reality of pre-revolutionary France. Education for impoverished girls was virtually non-existent in these rural coastal villages. The state had entirely neglected them.
They were completely on their own.
Right. So by opening this school, she wasn't just doing a nice charity project. She was engaging in a structural intervention. She was building a localized framework of stability, providing literacy and moral instruction to a demographic that society viewed as expendable.
She was quietly building empowerment right before the entire country tore itself apart. But that stability was destined to collide violently with the end of the 18th century. The outbreak of the French Revolution fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. As you know, the revolutionaries did not just seek political reform, they sought to entirely secularize society. They strictly outlawed traditional Catholic practices.
Which meant her school was immediately forced to shut down. The National Constituent Assembly issued decrees demanding that all clergy swear an oath of loyalty to the state over the church.
And those who refused?
The non-juring priests. They were instantly marked for death. They were hunted down, imprisoned, or sent directly to the guillotine. The environment rapidly transitioned into active, lethal state persecution. This is, of course, the era known as the Reign of Terror.
And this forced her out of the classroom and directly into the shadows. She pivoted from being a rural teacher to a clandestine operative for the underground church. She constructed a secret chapel hidden beneath the stairs of her own home to shelter these fugitive priests.
Think about the daily reality of that.
I mean, picture the architecture of a 1790s Norman house. You have tight spaces, creaking wood floors, incredibly thin walls. Harboring a non-juring priest meant an automatic death sentence for her and her entire family. How do you mask the scent of incense? How do you muffle the sound of the Latin Mass when the state police are quite literally at your door?
The intense daily terror of this period is suffocating. State persecution strips institutions down to their most fundamental acts of survival. The formal structures of the church had completely collapsed. The continuation of the faith was left entirely in the hands of clandestine networks run by people like Julie Postel.
Because the Jacobin bailiffs were constantly searching her house, right?
Constantly. The sources describe these agonizing moments where the Jacobins would be raiding her home, tearing through rooms, their boots echoing on the floorboards. And they would repeatedly walk blindly past the plainly visible door of the secret chapel right under the stairs.
So what does this all mean? Because ordained men were being systematically hunted and executed, the underground clergy had to make a radical decision. Julie received extraordinary, unprecedented authorization.
Something that just did not happen.
Right. She was permitted to keep the Blessed Sacrament in her home. She carried it hidden on her person through the streets to the sick, and she was even authorized to administer last rites in cases of emergency. Decades later, Pope Pius X would look back at this and dub her a maiden priest.
That specific authorization highlights a profound theological shock. You have to understand that the sacraments are the absolute core of Catholic theology. According to the strict doctrine of the time, the Eucharist could only be handled by the consecrated hands of ordained male priests.
No exceptions.
No exceptions. For a devout 18th century Catholic woman, who previously would have believed she shouldn't even touch the altar linens, to be entrusted with carrying the host and administering last rites is an absolute anomaly in a 2,000-year history. The surviving clergy acknowledged her competence and her bravery, but it also reflects the desperate, bleeding reality of their situation.
It is a profound historical irony. The revolution aggressively sought to dismantle traditional power structures. Yet, by driving the church underground, the revolution inadvertently forced the hierarchy to empower a laywoman with sacramental duties usually strictly gate-kept by men.
It forced their hand entirely.
The revolution meant to crush the church, but instead it created the exact pressure cooker conditions for Julie Postel to wield unprecedented religious authority.
But, eventually that pressure cooker lost its steam. When the immediate terror finally subsided, marked by Napoleon's Concordat of 1801, she emerged from the underground into a shattered society. The infrastructure of her world was gone. The moral fabric was torn.
The crisis was over, but the ruin was everywhere.
Right, so she spent years operating in the shadows, wielding this extraordinary authority. But once the terror subsides, she can't just go back to a normal life. The question becomes, how do you transition from a wartime operative to a peacetime architect?
Well, in 1807, at the age of 51, she answered that question. She formalized her mission, taking the religious name Marie Magdalene, and officially founded her religious community in Cherbourg.
Later known as the Sisters of the Christian Schools of Mercy.
Exactly. But this wasn't a triumphant, well-funded launch. The early years of this congregation were marked by severe, grinding destitution. She and her 9 fellow teachers were forced to live in a literal barn right next to their schoolroom.
The historical records detail the brutal mechanics of their poverty. To fund their teaching and simply secure enough caloric intake to survive, these women took on grueling manual labor. They worked as farmhands in the fields, they took in sewing, and worked as seamstresses late into the night by candlelight.
Just pushing their bodies to the absolute limit.
Right. They were attempting to sustain an educational institution while their own bodies were failing from exhaustion and malnutrition.
And the friction and misery were so intense that the Bishop of Cherbourg explicitly urged them to disband. He looked at the situation, saw the physical suffering, and determined it was an unsustainable failure. He ordered her to send the women home.
A direct order from a bishop.
Which is heavy. But Marie Magdalene simply refused to fold. She trusted her own vision over institutional pragmatism. It is highly analogous to a board of directors trying to liquidate a failing startup, but the founder just refuses to sign the papers because she knows the value of what they are building. She saw the necessity up close.
What's fascinating here is how her refusal to disband demonstrates a localized, calculated defiance of ecclesiastical authority in service of a higher vocational calling. She did not defy the bishop out of blind pride.
No, it was survival.
She knew the socioeconomic reality. If they disbanded, the impoverished girls of Cherbourg would immediately return to a life of illiteracy and severe neglect. To ensure their survival, she eventually adapted the order's operational framework, adopting the rule of Saint John Baptist de la Salle, which was specifically designed to sustain an educational focus.
And her tenacity secured the congregation's survival through decades of moving from town to town, seeking a permanent home. But to ensure true permanence, to make sure her work wouldn't vanish the moment she died, she recognized that they needed a massive physical anchor.
They needed roots.
Deep roots. This realization led to her most monumental physical achievement, which brings us back to the ruins we started with at the beginning of this deep dive. In 1832, at the advanced age of 76, she purchased the ruined Abbey of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte for 68,000 francs to serve as her headquarters.
To understand the sheer weight of this purchase, you really must look at the Abbey's brutal historical density. It was founded back in 1067.
Over 700 years prior.
Right. Founded by Viscount Nel II de Saint-Sauveur, built by Benedictine monks. During the Hundred Years' War, its proximity to a local castle meant it was repeatedly fortified and attacked. In 1360, the English commander, Sir John Chandos, thoroughly pillaged the abbey and razed its choir to the ground.
And if surviving the artillery of the Hundred Years' War was not enough, the French Revolution finished the job. In 1791, the lands were confiscated and sold as national property. By 1793, the magnificent medieval church was sold to private buyers who actively dismantled it.
Literally piece by piece.
They used the sacred space as a stone quarry, ripping down vaulted ceilings to sell the limestone for cheap building materials. So when Marie Magdalene Postel arrived at age 76, she was looking at a desolate landscape of collapsed roofs, shattered pillars, and scattered stone.
But refusing to let the ruins die, she initiated a massive, seemingly impossible reconstruction effort. At age 82, she was physically present on the site, working alongside the laborers.
Age 82.
Yes. She hired a self-taught local artisan, François Halley, to serve as the lead architect and sculptor. Halley had spent 4 years traveling across France just to master carpentry and medieval stone carving. Together, they had to reverse engineer 11th century Romanesque and Gothic architecture, figuring out mortar curing times and keystone placement with almost no budget.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because nature itself decided to push back. In 1843, they faced a devastating setback. A violent storm tore through the peninsula. The wind and rain were so severe that the newly rebuilt bell tower completely collapsed, sending tons of heavy limestone crashing down, heavily crushing the transept and destroying the initial choir bays they had just spent a decade building.
And at this point, she was approaching 90 years old. Think about the physical and emotional mechanics of that moment. The financial toll of seeing years of painstaking, back-breaking labor destroyed in a single night would have broken most leaders.
Most people would just walk away.
The rational response is to surrender. Instead, she remained entirely unfazed. She surveyed the damage, turned to Halley, and simply commissioned him to rebuild it again.
You have to pause and visualize the sheer logistical absurdity of this. You have an octogenarian rebuilding a medieval fortress abbey after a natural disaster. The sheer force of will required to look at a collapsed bell tower in your late 80s with limited funds and say, "Clear the rubble, we start over tomorrow," is staggering.
It defies logic.
It really does. To fund this second reconstruction, she dispatched her relative, Sister Placide Ville, to beg for subsidies.
And the historical sources playfully contradict themselves regarding their exact relationship. Some texts refer to Placide Ville as her niece, others as her aunt.
Right.
But regardless of the precise familial tie, Placide executed a brilliant political maneuver. She successfully appealed directly to Queen Marie Amélie, the consort of King Louis Philippe I. Securing those royal subsidies provided the crucial financial injection they needed to pay the laborers and resume the heavy masonry work.
Rebuilding Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte was not just a construction project. It was a statement of defiance.
It was an architectural resurrection. By reclaiming this specific site, she was reversing the erasure attempted by two separate, devastating historical conflicts, the 100 Years' War and the French Revolution. It was a physical manifestation of her core theology: that which is ruined can be redeemed and rebuilt.
By setting those massive stones back into place, she was embedding her congregation into the deep historical bedrock of Normandy, ensuring they could not be easily removed.
And she lived just long enough to ensure the stone was set, and her congregation's roots were deep enough to outlive her. She died on July 16, 1846, at nearly 90 years old. The Abbey church she fought so hard to rebuild was finally reconsecrated 10 years after her death, in 1856.
François Halley, the self-taught artisan she had trusted with the architecture, utilized his mastery of stone carving one final time to craft her tomb. Today, her relics are venerated in the North Transept Chapel of the Abbey. She rests alongside Blessed Placide Ville and Blessed Marthe Le Boutier.
Additionally, a distinct relic is kept in the Church of St. Nicholas, in her hometown of Barfleur, tying her legacy back to the rugged coast where she first learned endurance.
Her congregation, which started with starving women freezing in a barn in Cherbourg, spread worldwide. We can see a specific modern echo of her legacy detailed in the safeguarding records of the congregation's Anglo-Irish region.
Right, over 50 years ago, a branch of her sisters moved to Roscrea, Ireland.
They initially arrived to assist Cistercian monks in running a boarding school, providing domestic and healthcare support. But their mission evolved to meet the friction of the modern era.
They shifted their focus to open a hostel for young adult women entering the workforce, providing them with a secure foundation.
Which mirrors her early school in Barfleur.
It does. And eventually, they opened a nursing home to care for their own elderly sisters, a mission which then expanded to care for other vulnerable elderly individuals in the surrounding community.
It is a quiet, direct reflection of her original dedication. She started her life by educating the vulnerable, neglected youth of Barfleur, and her successors continue her work by providing dignity and care to the vulnerable elderly in Roscrea.
This raises an important question regarding how we interact with history. How do physical relics and stone abbeys function as geographical anchors for historical memory?
That's a profound point.
An individual's life is comprised of ephemeral actions: teaching a child to read, hiding a terrified priest under the stairs, giving away a meal. These actions vanish into the ether the moment they're completed. But by leaving behind a resurrected medieval abbey and venerated relics, her ephemeral life becomes permanently tangible. The sheer weight of the stone demands that the future remembers the actions of the past.
It anchors the narrative so it cannot be swept away by the next political regime or the next societal shift. The massive walls of the Abbey of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte stand as a physical ledger of her defiance against destruction. Her single life served as a human bridge across wildly different epochs. She was born under the pre-revolutionary monarchy, navigated the bloody, lethal chaos of the Reign of Terror, and established a formalized, permanent institution in the industrial 19th century.
And that defiance was eventually recognized by the global church infrastructure that she helped save. She was beatified in 1908 by Pope Pius X and canonized as a saint in 1925 by Pope Pius X, cementing her legacy not just as a survivor of the revolution, but as a foundational builder of the modern era.
As we conclude this deep dive, we ask you to consider a lingering concept to explore on your own. Think back to the very beginning of her resistance. Think of that hidden door under the wooden stairs in her childhood home in Barfleur. How many unrecorded histories of resistance are currently hidden beneath the floorboards of ordinary homes? History is often shaped not by standing armies or loud political declarations, but by the quiet, iron-willed defiance of people whom society otherwise ignores. What secret chapels exist today in the face of modern ideological conflicts? Where are the quiet spaces of preservation being built right now, waiting to rebuild the ruins of tomorrow? Think about that as you look at the architecture of your own life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.